Anyway, I'm not planning on using
I
all this for
understand.
the interview, by the way. I was just
Yeah, no worries. I'm good. I'm glad you're giving me this context.
yeah, just trying to let you know who this rando that you jumped on onto this for this. Thank you for responding, man. That meant a lot. I felt like I was kind of taking a flyer. I appreciate you taking a chance on me.
Oh, for sure, man. I'm happy to do it.
How's your life been since the book came out?
Really a whirlwind these past 3 to 4 weeks, really since the George Floyd video came out. And it's been nonstop and a roller coaster of different emotions. Like on the one hand, I'm excited that people are sitting up and paying attention, that some changes are happening. And on the other hand, there are just these moments when I like hit a wall of exhaustion. And it's like I can't do anything functional today. So I never quite know what's coming next.
I don't. I mean, I don't know how you do it, to be honest. I mean, because this stuff weighs heavy on me, and I'm a freaking white dude. It's like, it's like I can take it off, like I can escape it. It's
Right.
like when it's not just having to carry it with you everywhere you go, but also that like it's not just for me, it's a philosophical thing. It's
Yeah.
not a
Yeah.
lived in experiences where I have been traumatized and I have and it's
Right.
like carrying all of that. I
Right.
watch those of you who are black who are in the trenches every day, and one, my heart goes out to you, and I'm impressed, and also I'm like concerned sometimes. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
hope you're all okay, because like, man, there ain't nothing in God's kingdom that needs us. We get to participate in it, but it's like we're valued and loved just because God said that,
Yeah.
and um I know I have to cling to that in areas of my life, and so I'll be praying for you, man, just that God
I
would.
definitely appreciate that.
Yeah. Anyway, tell me a little bit about yourself, man. I don't, I
Hmm.
deliberately didn't do too much research about you, the person.
Hmm.
Tell me a little bit about you.
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest in the Chicagoland area, and became a Christian in high school through a white evangelical youth group. And
Okay.
so I had a friend in high school, goofy white dude with a great jump shot, who invited me to his church youth group, and I didn't know the difference. I mean, we hadn't grown up Christian. We weren't hostile to the faith by any means, but this was sort of my first real introduction. And the youth pastor in his little 15-minute sermonettes just made sense.
Yeah.
And I had your sort of classic conversion story, prayed the sinner's prayer and all that stuff, and became a Christian. But it was always a case in which, racially speaking, I was a minority. So I was always kind of aware of that, didn't have the language or the framework to really analyze it. Um, Went to undergrad at the University of Notre Dame, and ended up having a great experience there. But it was also a racial awakening because
Sure.
black students there are still, I want to say, in the single digits
Yeah.
in terms of a percentage. Um, so there was a lot of stuff that was going on then. Like, I was the only black person on the floor on my dorm.
Mm.
Uh, the other black people who were on campus, probably 2/3 of them were athletes, and so I was not. So I wasn't even plugged into that community.
Sure.
Um, so it was tough, and that's when I stumbled on this thing called Reformed theology. I had no idea what it
Yeah.
was or what the name
Yeah.
was. That same friend from high school sent me a book by John Piper. It's like, oh my. When I look back at my journey, I'm like,
Uh,
wow. Um, so, but he talked a lot about the Bible, and I was at this
sure.
Catholic school, and there was all this stuff about the Pope and Catholic tradition. And I was like, I don't know anything about that. I'm Protestant, so it was talking about the Bible, and I just went, just started learning more. Ended up going to a Dutch Reformed church in town, which was another trippy experience,
Yeah.
racially speaking. Um,
You just decided to be a part of every white Christian niche
Exactly.
that there
The
was.
I was trying to get to the whitest part of Christianity
Dutch Reform's pretty
progressively.
close, my friend.
As I found out, as I discovered. And then in the midst of that, I get down to pretty much the blackest part of the country. So I joined Teach for America after
Yeah.
college, and they placed me in the Mississippi Delta on the Arkansas side. That's where I live to this day. And my town is 75% Black. The Delta in both Mississippi and Arkansas is the poorest part of each state and also has the highest percentage of Black people in each state in that region. And that's obviously not a coincidence, right? It goes all the way back to sharecropping and then slavery before that. So, really started to think about issues of justice, being a teacher down here, and things about, generational and concentrated poverty, things like mass incarceration. A lot of our students' parents were in the criminal justice system in some way, shape, or form, food deserts, all of these kind of things. And finding out that this sort of like branch of Christianity that I was in didn't really speak much to those material concerns. I think things really came to a head for me when I moved down to Jackson, Mississippi to go to seminary at Reformed Theological Seminary, which again, one of the whitest and the most southern places you could go. And that was really difficult because it was these two poles. So I was really starting to define my ministry in terms of racial justice. So that's when I started what became The Witness. Also started something called the African American Leadership Initiative at the seminary, which was designed to recruit more Black students to the seminary. But just as that's happening, also starting to get a lot of pushback, because now I'm doing these things out loud and publicly and building organizations and institutions. And so all of that stuff, especially wrapped in southernness, maleness, patriarchy, all of this stuff is coming at me. And I wasn't really prepared for it. So it was pretty bracing. Then the Black Lives Matter movement goes on in end of 2014 and into 2015. And that was just like very eye-opening. Not that I didn't have an inclination before, but because now it's topic of a national conversation, it's revealing fissures more clearly than I'd ever seen before between Black and white Christians. So that kind of pretty much brings us up to the present. And I think the only other big part is throughout that time, I developed a passion for history and enrolled at the University of Mississippi, where I'm getting a PhD in history right now. And that's really kind of what gave me the background to write the book, The Color of Compromise.
So if I can ask you, you said that even for you, someone who had been living in this world for a while of thinking about this stuff, that even you were surprised by the fissures between Black and white Christians. Can you flesh that out for me, how you experienced that, what you've seen in the last few years?
Yeah. It was like Malcolm X said, we were hoodwinked, bamboozled, run amok, led astray by white Christians who from, I would say, the mid-1990s up to the early 2010s had promoted this evangelical idea of racial reconciliation that turned out to be extremely anemic, especially when it came to issues of justice. And so I think the fundamental problem is that they misdiagnosed the problem. They identified the problem as the separation of the races. And so if that's the problem, then what's the solution? Well, get everybody together. Let's do pulpit swaps. Let's have multi-ethnic churches. Let's have panel discussions with people of different races and ethnicities. And then the very act of getting together or having a dialogue or being near each other then became the solution to racism. Left out of that equation altogether were issues of justice like anti-Black police brutality, like the racial wealth gap, which is large and growing, like issues of mass incarceration and sentencing disparities and all of this stuff. And not only was it left out, there was a hostility to it. So I think that's the part that was a little bit bracing, right? Like it wasn't just, oh, we forgot that, or oh, we never, please enlighten us. It was like, no, that's not part of Christianity. That's not part of the gospel. And if you engage in that, it used to be the language was, they'll still say liberal, but they used to be call you communist, Marxist, which that stuff goes back to the mid 20th century. You got white evangelicals saying that about the civil rights movement. But
I just got called that today.
Oh yeah. Hey, welcome to the club. Your membership card is in the mail. um, yeah, so now that language has been updated, the communist 2.0 or the Marxist 2.0 is critical race theory. I don't know if you've seen that floating around. And it's absolutely infuriating. If I had hair, we're rocking the same hairstyles here.
Yeah.
Um, if I had hair, I'd pull it out, man. It is so frustrating. Yeah, pull the beard. That's biblical, right?
It is biblical, yeah.
So now I get it. That rage, it is so infuriating because it was this slow motion train wreck of I saw these like far right fundamentalist white Christians saying, "Oh, it's critical race theory," and I think they latched onto it. I'm gonna probably do an Instagram live on this, but I think they latched onto it because it gave them a concrete target. I think they had been fumbling and stumbling and backpedaling a little bit because Black Lives Matter had taken hold. You know, you had all these Black Christians getting more voices and writing books and platforms. And then they were scrambling for a little while to catch up and refute it. They were never for it, but they didn't have the right sort of lightning rod to attract opposition until somebody stumbled on critical race theory.
Well, I mean, there's like, oh gosh, already I have so many things I want to talk to you about. But okay, so on that last thing, there's probably a better question that I'll get to next, but I'm going to ask this one because it's personal for me. Is I grew up, I don't know if you caught this in the world of Christianity you grew up in. I had Christian worldview training. That was a big thing of my upbringing. Christian worldview training was saying there's a fundamentally Christian way of viewing the world, and then there are competing ideologies. And they're going to come in through universities, they're going to come in through Hollywood, they're going to come in through all these different areas, and they are going to undercut the foundation of Christianity. Now, I don't think it's fair to probably say it's all true or all not true or really get into all that. But what's deceptive about it is it teaches you to say anything that you don't currently agree with is probably coming from a competing ideology that isn't Christian. And it's like, I hear you say that.
Yeah.
And it's like, so what do you say then as someone who's like facing like getting the critical race theory thing thrown in your face? What do you
Yeah.
do?
I mean, I was hoping that we wouldn't give it oxygen, right? That we would
Yeah.
suffocate it like a fire. That's honestly the best response is like to keep it moving. And in general, that's what I've done. So I wrote one article about this, I don't know, 6, 8 months ago, where essentially I said, more than ignore these folks, like don't platform them, right? Like don't promote what they're saying and doing. And then people are like, "Oh, that's cancel culture," which is a whole different conversation. So I think ideally was it Toni Morrison who said the function of racism is distraction? And in a very real way, that is so true. So critical race theory at its most fundamental in this conversation is a distraction because of what they're making it out to be is not what it actually is. Whether both in how they're creating a straw man of the theory, but also and more importantly, even in how they're characterizing it as essentially the greatest threat to Christianity in the United States today. So in that sense, it's a massive distraction. How you refute it is hard to say. There are social scientists who deal with this stuff, who are Christian, who can go point by point and argue and refute it. The way I look at it is tons of history, and so many things that critical race theorists are saying as far as an analysis of racism and white supremacy, it's not new. And so you can go back to, MLK's analysis of the issue, Fannie Lou Hamer's analysis of the issue, Ida B. Wells' analysis of the issues, Frederick Douglass's analysis of the issue, the Black church tradition more broadly analysis of issues of racism and white supremacy. And so if you want to characterize everything as a result of this clash of worldviews, critical race theory versus Christianity, then you have to account for the fact that a lot of the diagnosis and a lot of the analysis predated Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who coined the term critical race theory, right? So then what? What you're essentially saying, or what you then have to argue, is against a long tradition of prophetic Christianity that is present far apart from critical race theory.
So to lean into something that you're talking about, as I have been reading through your book, one of the things that's chilling to me is hearing scriptural arguments that are so familiar to how I hear scripture being used today. So like you explain in pretty good depth how scriptural arguments were used to defend slavery. And I am able to draw a through line, maybe not to defending slavery, but just a way of approaching the Bible, a way of approaching culture. I'm curious for you, as someone who became a Christian in high school, grew up in an evangelical culture, and then kind of went on this journey. What was that like for you, seeing some of these same things showing up? You're like, this has been around for a long time.
In a way, it was a relief to know that I wasn't making it up, right? Like the things that struck me as wrong or off in the present, yeah, that's actually accurate, and other people have seen it because it's been around for a long time. And it was a relief because I think it gives us tools to help decolonize our faith and decolonize our theology. So much of what I received, having my formative Christian years in white Christian circles, I just assumed was true and biblical, right? This very literalist reading of the Bible that would take something like, preaching good news to the poor only really meant the spiritually poor and not the materially poor, right? Or if it did, it was tangential and not, really core to the message. Ways of interpreting, ways of doing church, from the aesthetic ways like the music you hear, but also taking preaching classes in seminary and being trained in this very sort of linear cognitive style of preaching that is far apart from the Black church tradition, which is much more holistic of body and emotions and mind as well. So all of those things, and as I'm learning this history and how people have perverted scripture to really prop up white supremacy, it was hard and difficult, but at the same time, being able to name something really helps to deal with it.
So I know you can't speak for every Black person in every white evangelical church. I would never ask you to, but I am curious from your experience, what does it do for someone? How does it affect someone growing up as a Black man in a Black culture, but then attending a white evangelical version of Christianity? How does that play out? What cognitive distances does that create? What identity crises does that create?
Yeah. I'm probably still working through all of that with my therapist.
We laugh because it's sad.
Exactly, trauma laughter. It's not vastly different than simply being a racial or ethnic minority in the United States generally, right? Because we're always in situations, whether through school or work or church, where we are forced to live in these two different worlds. But when it's an issue of faith and spirituality, that which is core to sort of how we see the world and how we define ourselves, then there are many identity crises, right? There's not one single moment where you realize something went wrong and you fix it and you're good to go forever. I think for me and for many other Black Christians, it's an ongoing process of discovering the beauty in our Blackness, in our heritage, in our culture, in the midst of environments that have outright denigrated it or at the very least overlooked it. So it's a reclaiming, and it's a constant kind of a thing where it's almost a sanctification process of accepting ourselves fully as image bearers of God, and not just as souls that God saves apart from our bodies and our lived
Ugh.
experience.
I mean, you just touched on something. I mean, the exact words you just used were something that I have been leveled by reading your book, which is the white Christianity's ongoing methodology of we are going to care for black souls, but not black bodies. Explain to me and to people watching this a little bit about how that has played out, a couple of examples of how that's played out in history, and then I would love to hear you even talk about how that's still happening right now.
That's good. Yeah. So, and I would nuance it a bit to say that white people and white Christians have always cared greatly about black bodies, but in the sense of controlling them, surveilling them, punishing them, which we see, of course, today, and the issue at hand of anti-black police brutality, and how white supremacy literally can kneel on the neck of black bodies and for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and slowly kill us, but also killing us and controlling us in many other ways. And that has a long history. So it has a theological history where in the 1790s, a Baptist denomination at the denominational level passed a resolution saying that you couldn't be a slaveholder and a Christian in good standing. Well, when that went back to the congregations, there was such an uproar that the denomination had to backtrack and say, wait, we didn't mean it. Actually, slavery is a political and a civil issue, and it's beyond the scope of the church to address. So we're going to stick to quote unquote gospel matters or spiritual matters. Now, this was always very selective, right? What they considered political or civil issue, because in the 20th century, for instance, white evangelical Christians were perfectly happy to fight the culture wars over the Bible in schools, over prayer in schools, of course, over abortion and Roe v. Wade, even during Prohibition, right? They saw a direct connection between their faith and working for political change. But when it comes to issues of race and white supremacy, well, all of a sudden it's hands off, right? And then you talked about the division of body and soul. That has a long history too. And so in the early 1800s, there's a missionary named Francis Lejeune, who's with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. He's a white Catholic evangelist. And when in those few instances where he's able to get people of African or Native American descent to convert to Christianity, at the time of their baptism, he has them recite vows which say, you undertake baptism purely out of a concern for your own soul and not out of any desire for your emancipation. And so what he was essentially saying was, God can have your soul, but we own your body. And that is race-based chattel slavery. That is separate but equal, determining you can go in these spaces, but not these spaces. That is the modern church, which remains segregated. That is the police force, which controls black bodies through coercion and violence and handcuffs and iron bars. So that control and surveillance and even brutalizing of black bodies persists today.
There is a so as someone who grew up in I am as whatever you would like, whatever the like white evangelical bingo is, man, I've got them all. Like not just one line, I've got them all. Like I mean, there are very few things that I'm not going to be able to check off. The eye-opening thing for me, and it probably goes back to Ferguson. That was when I finally started, just for the first time. For the first time in my life, I'm 30, that point in time, 34 years old. And all of a sudden, as a 33-year-old guy, some light bulbs start going off, and I start getting it. As someone who's been around white evangelicalism yourself, why can white evangelicalism not see its own problem?
That's a great question. From a sociological viewpoint, I think Michael Emerson and Christian Smith have some really good insights in their book, Divided by Faith. So if you haven't read it, I always recommend it. And I mean, they basically make the argument that the way white evangelicals understand the faith in itself works against their stated commitments towards racial reconciliation and diversity. And they talk about the white evangelical cultural toolkit and three ideas around that, which is individualism, anti-structuralism, and relationalism, essentially. And so, you know, the long and the short of it is this cultural toolkit reduces everything down to the individual and the personal level. And so when you look at an issue like racism, and this is attached to theological beliefs, right? Like salvation is your individual walk with Jesus. It's your personal decision to follow Christ, right? It's all very individualized. And the Bible, all everywhere is communal, right? When in the Old Testament, God is indicting people, he indicts whole communities or entire cities. Even repentance, if you look at Nehemiah and other similar books, it's on behalf of the community, right? Even the Old Testament Levitical rituals, it's atoning for sins on behalf of the community. And in the New Testament too, it's to the letters are written to the church in Corinth, to the church in Ephesus. It's very rarely just an individual person that's coming into play. Obviously, not that there aren't individual dimensions to it, but in the race conversation, all of that boils down to, well, racism is an individual problem of interpersonal prejudice. So it's one person not liking someone else. Yeah. It's somebody using racial epithets or being mean to someone else. Therefore, the solution is I'm nice to other people who are different. And guess what? Some of my best friends are Black, which 90% of the time, if you ask that best friend, if there's a best friend, that Black person would be like, what are you talking about? We talk like twice. It's so amazing how white people have so many best friends who are Black, but the Black people probably wouldn't agree. So, you know, you ask why it's so hard for like white evangelicals to get it and to acknowledge that race is such a big structural systemic, partly because of the way they understand theology and therefore the way they understand race. And it's very difficult to broaden the issue of racism and white supremacy beyond the individual and interpersonal level.
So if I'm hearing you right, it's almost like we think more like Americans than we do like Christians.
The work of Andrew Whitehead and his co-author, they're sociologists again. And I think they're right to say that a lot of times what we define as sort of white evangelicalism is actually white Christian nationalism. And like you're saying, you know, many times people think more American than more Christian. And that's the nationalism at play, where you can't tell where, you know, the Christian faith ends and a version of patriotism begins. So, yeah, I think that's a big issue.
But I mean, there's the stuff that you probably saw too, but I for sure grew up with, you know, Flag and Country Day and patriotism and the church service. But even on more of a subtle level than that, I mean, you're talking about how did we read a Bible that, you're right, is communal from beginning to end, and where the sins of one person affect the sins of the community. And that's not like just an Old Testament thing. It's a New Testament thing too, like you said. And it's like, and yet we have taken it and we've turned salvation and sanctification and all of that into individualized things. And I'm hearing that. I'm like, well, I can't help but think that's more because of our Declaration of Independence than it is because of the Bible. It's like you have the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of your own happiness, and each person makes whatever themselves they're going to make. Which, I mean, we can talk about the relative merits or demerits of that as a social construct politically, but like, that's not the Bible.
Right.
That's not what we've ever been called to live.
Yeah, and again, it's just so interesting. You know, in the chapter in the book on the Civil War, I reference Mark Knoll's book. He's a historian out of Notre Dame, and his book, The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, and how the Civil War, in many ways, is not just a battle over the soul of the nation, but a battle over the Bible. And so, pro-slavery theologians and pro-slavery Christians were saying, Listen, the Bible never explicitly condemns slavery. And so if it's not there, if Jesus never spoke a word about it, et cetera, then it can't be that bad. And what we need to do is practice the institution as good Christians, which meant evangelizing enslaved people and maybe not beating them too badly. And they tried to differentiate between good slave owners and bad slave owners. Meanwhile, Christian abolitionists who were mostly in the North or different parts of the country, they were taking sort of the thrust and the momentum and the spirit of the law to say, listen, if we're reading this right, love God and love neighbor, treat other people as you would want to be treated, Jesus's love ethic, etc., and even the Levitical commands against man stealing and things like that, then race-based chattel slavery is an unequivocal evil, and it's a sin. And then the pro-slavery theologians are saying, well, you're doing funny things with the Bible. You're being liberal.
Yeah.
We're the ones who honor God's word. And you can see those battles, of course, playing out today.
Well, you say, of course, and I have a wry smile on my face. But how? How do we see that playing out today? Like, from your point of view?
So we were talking earlier about critical race theory, right? So they've labeled people who want to push forward on racial justice as taking cues more from the world than from the Bible. And basically saying, you don't have a biblical basis to say there's systemic or institutional racism. Sin is only on the individual level. How can a system be racist? And they're saying, there are progressive Christians who have always tried to press for racial justice. And so these are folks who would affirm different things in the Bible. They might be, they might ordain women. They might be LGBTQ affirming, and they'll take those positions and stances, fundamentalists will, and say, well, you don't actually believe the Bible. Right. We do. Right. But what happens is those quote unquote Bible believing fundamentalists end up being not just lagging behind on issues of racial justice, but oftentimes outright opposing.
Yeah, that was something that was sobering for me as someone who grew up as a product of the moral majority movement. I mean, very much. That is my upbringing. I was born in 81. And so, right around the time that I'm being able to like think and understand the world bigger, it's like the time that we're getting out of the Reagan years and heading it, and Clinton's just around the corner, and the rise of all of talk radio and all that stuff. And so like that for me, as the area of my training, my upbringing in a lot of ways, and to look back and realize that not only that era, but the era that led to it and the era that led to that, we were on the wrong side of history every single time. That's sobering.
That religious right and the moral majority, the feedback on the book, even from sort of people who I already expected not to like it, their critiques weren't that heavy, sort of the further in the past you talk about, right?
Totally. Yeah.
1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s up to the Civil War, and then the Civil War is a little bit dicey. But they really get mad when you talk about the 1970s and 80s and the rise of religious right.
Well, and the reason is because racism died with MLK. That's
right. Exactly.
That's what I wasn't taught that. No one ever said that directly. But the implication was, and then everything got fixed, and now we don't deal with racism anymore. I mean, that's genuinely what I thought up until 10 years ago, maybe?
Yeah. Well, the perfect illustration of your point is the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., so like it affects a lot of people. So SBTS did a study of its racist history, and the fact that its founders were all slaveholders, the fact that when the seminary almost went bankrupt in the late 19th century, it was saved by someone who made his wealth in part through convict leasing, former governor of Georgia. And so they're actually really unflinching about that history from its founding in the 19th century on up to the mid 20th century. But the problem with that whole report is that it stops in the 1960s. And the implication is racism was over and everything was better. Now, obviously, they wouldn't say that. But when you stop analyzing your institution's history from 50 years ago and don't account for anything that happened, particularly the religious right and the moral majority and this unholy marriage between a version of Christianity and the modern Republican Party, then that's very telling about what you believe about race.
Oh man, I could talk to you for another 2 hours about this stuff, but to start wrapping up, a couple of questions for you. We are releasing this on Juneteenth. I will leave it to the people watching this to do their own research on what Juneteenth is. I might even include a link. It's very simple to find out about it. So I'm going to not make you explain that. What I would love for you to explain instead is why should white Christians not just care about Juneteenth, but maybe even participate in celebrating it? And how do we go about celebrating it? Is that weird? Are we allowed? Like, what do we do?
That's good. That's good. I think we're feeling this out. So this is the first year where I've seen like a big national push to celebrate Juneteenth. And there are even some big corporations that are giving their workers a day off for Juneteenth, which is
I don't know if you saw this. Donald Trump just took credit for it today and said he made it famous, and he's very proud of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Sorry.
Wonderful. Just threw up a little bit in my mouth.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I shouldn't have brought it up.
No,
we made it. We made it this far without mentioning our current political reality.
Would it be complete? So, especially for white people, you can only celebrate the joy of emancipation to the extent that you know the sorrow of slavery. So that means if you go into Juneteenth like, okay, hey, this is great, celebrate Black emancipation, but don't understand why emancipation was such a big deal, right? The brutality of slavery. You can just read the first few chapters in The Color of Compromise that talk in the antebellum period during when slavery was around. This is race-based chattel slavery. Can we clarify that? So race-based is pretty clear that people of African descent were coded as slaves. And that was not true of any other group on a widespread basis. For a time, they tried to do that with Native Americans. They have their own separate history that's brutal and ugly and full of suffering.
Yeah.
But no other group was just coded from the jump by their appearance as slaves. But then not just race-based, it was chattel slavery. Chattel means property, which legal and a social sense meant that Black people were considered in the same category as a plow or a cart. And the most brutal, one of the most brutal books that illustrates this so clearly is by Walter Johnson, and it's called Soul by Soul. And he goes through, he focuses on New Orleans, which was the largest port slave for a while. And he looks at the actual ledgers that show the transactions of slave traders and slave buyers. And there's literally a dollar amount attached to Black life, which is just the epitome of commodification and dehumanization, where you treat people as property. And because you treated people as property, where Black people were only valued for our utility, how much labor we could produce, and for Black women, not just their labor, but their reproductive labor, how many babies they could produce by rape often. That meant that we were treated as property, which was where the mutilation comes, where they're cutting off hands and toes and other body parts. It's the whippings and these pictures of the scars on the backs of people. It's the torture where they would put brine, which is salt water, into those fresh wounds, which lore has it that Robert E. Lee did with his enslaved people. So if you don't go back and actually study that history, you really don't have um, have a right to celebrate Juneteenth, because what you're doing is exploiting uh, the the labor primarily of Black people who are pushing back against our own oppression, but also our allies and advocates. You haven't done the hard work, even of just looking back and examining the brutality of our racist past of race-based chattel slavery. So what do you have to celebrate is all I'm saying. If you don't know why emancipation was such a big deal. That was just the first part of your question, but it's this tension that I feel, because in the book I say we need to make Juneteenth a national holiday, because just in terms of US history, this is one of the most epochal events in our country's history, that this institution of race-based chattel slavery, which was so resilient that it required America's bloodiest war to finally abolish, like just from a US history standpoint, not just from a Black history standpoint, that's something we need to commemorate each and every year. But at the same time, I'm torn, because I know that people will enter into this holiday unthinkingly and uncritically, and never really do the hard work of understanding why we need such a moment to celebrate emancipation.
So what I hear you saying is, if we're gonna do it, we better do it soberly.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, take it seriously, and
especially white folks, but Black folks too. I mean, people of color too. Like, just this history is not taught very much.
yeah.
So we all have to do our homework, but in particular, white folks who have benefited from this system of white supremacy.
So, two more questions and I'll be done. The first one is this. What do white Christians do?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is the subject of my next book.
Hey! Is it really?
Yeah, it's on Amazon for pre-order.
Here's
and it's
how
called
bad of a interviewer I am. I didn't even know that. I'm so glad I brought it up. You get to plug your new book. Excellent.
Yes, absolutely. Well, don't feel bad. It was just recently that I've started talking about it. And it's called How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity, and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. And if you've read The Color of Compromise, then the last chapter is basically devoted to practical steps or initiatives that we can take to fight racism. So this next book, How to Fight Racism, is sort of that chapter expanded into book form. And it's designed to be an answer to the question that I get everywhere I go, from coast to coast, churches, conferences, colleges. People are always asking, what do we do? Yeah. And so this book is one response to that question. It's designed around this model I've been developing for a couple years called the arc of racial justice. My concern is that we approach racial justice holistically. If you look at what the response has been, a lot of it's recommending books, which is great for me because a lot of people are recommending The Color of Compromise. But that's just one part of it. So the arc of racial justice is an acronym that stands for awareness, relationships, commitment. And I think all three of those components are necessary for a holistic approach to fighting racism. So awareness is building your knowledge about race, racism, white supremacy, US history, all those things. It's recommending books. It's listening to panel discussions. It's watching documentaries. And you need to do that because racism operates according to a playbook. We need to know how it works. But that's not all. There's a relational aspect to it. And from a Christian frame, when God wanted to reconcile people to God didn't send a TikTok video or an email. God sent Jesus, person. Yeah. He came in the flesh to develop relationships, to be in relation, and has designed his church to be a relational body. And so in a theological sense, all reconciliation is relational. And so that gets to the idea of developing those personal networks, social networks, and even professional networks that are diverse. Problem is, especially within white evangelical Christianity, this emphasis on racial reconciliation and those personal relationships is where people stop. And so they'll say, well, listen, I just had coffee with my Black friend, or, we have these, pulpit swaps and work closely with this Black church, or et cetera, et cetera. But what I say is all the cups of coffee in the world aren't going to do a thing about mass incarceration.
Right.
All of the panel discussions that you could possibly hold aren't going to do a thing in and of themselves about the racial wealth gap. So that's where the commitment aspect comes in, a commitment to changing racist policies, to acknowledging the fact that racism isn't just carried out by individual people and their actions, but it's inscribed into the laws, into the policies, into the practices of the way we do society. And those need to change as well. And so when you ask what to do, the book, How to Fight Racism, is chock full of dozens of concrete examples. But I think thinking broadly in those categories helps us to have a more holistic approach to what we can do.
Gosh, that's good, man. And then lastly, and feel free to dodge this question because I'm springing it on you. How are you and Jesus? How's your faith doing these days?
So it was extremely difficult, I'd say, from like 2015 to 2017, maybe 2018, because there was such a deep sense of betrayal from the Christian communities that I'd been a part of. I was part of a multi-ethnic church that was part of a broader white denomination, and so had lots of issues there, even as they were trying to be diverse. The seminary that I told you about was extremely difficult, where I even had classmates talking bad about, what we were doing, always behind my back, but it would get back to me. These are guys I sat in class with, maybe collaborated with on projects. And so in that time, I just needed a period of healing where I was, on track to be ordained, right? And I had to take a far back seat just for some spiritual healing and recovery. And it's only been in the past, 8, 12 months, I started to regain some of the footing, develop that, start, feeling closer to God. God's always been close to me, but me feeling close to God. In God's economy, it's a strange thing that the sort of darker it gets in terms of our circumstances, the brighter God shines, especially through God's people. So I've been blessed to experience some really sweet fellowship with particularly other Black Christians who understand what I'm going through, who have been through it themselves and can walk with me in this journey.
Thank you for answering that. And what I hope that the people who watch this, listen to this, what I hope they, among many things that I hope they take away from it is, I think what a lot of us who grew up white evangelicals and maybe still are white evangelicals need to hear is that we're still actively hurting our Black brothers and sisters. And I'm sorry, man. I really am. I really am. I've participated in things that have hurt you. And so I really do apologize, and I'll try to do better.
I appreciate that, man. I know we just met, but I appreciate your sincerity, your great questions, and for engaging in this fight for racial justice.
Yeah.